When I was a kid, my grandmother used to slap the back of my hand if I kicked off my shoes carelessly. "Don't leave them like that," she'd say, already bending over to fix them. "If someone dies nearby, they'll see your souls and think they're being summoned." I didn't know what she meant, not really. She never explained it in full, and I never asked more than once. But I understood it the way you understand not to whistle at night or touch someone's offering table. You didn't need to believe to know you shouldn't mess with it. Even in the city, the habit stuck. Every household on our floor lined their shoes neatly outside the door, soles flat, toes facing out. Teachers checked the cubby rows in school and made you straighten your shoes if one was flipped. If someone dropped their slipper on the bus, they'd pick it up quickly, awkwardly, even if it didn't matter. It was just something we all did, like breathing. Leaving them like that invites the wrong kind of attention, my grandmother once said while sweeping the entryway. The living walk with heels first, the dead follow souls. I didn't know if that was poetry or folklore. With her, it was always somewhere in between. She died last spring in her sleep, with a rosary still clutched in her hand and her slippers placed side by side under the bed. No one dared move them, not even after she was cremated. My mother vacuumed around them for 2 weeks until my father finally picked them up one morning and tucked them into a plastic bag. We didn't ask where he took it. A month after her funeral, we moved, not because of her death, at least not entirely. My father had been laid off for the second time in 2 years, and my uncle wanted to sell the apartment we rented. There wasn't much to argue about. We packed what we could, sold what we couldn't, and left the city in a borrowed van with 3 mattresses strapped to the roof and the rest jammed in cardboard boxes. The farmhouse had been in our family for 3 generations. My grandfather died there. My father was born there. It sat on a slope above a smaller village about 2 hours from Kylie City, reachable only by a winding gravel path that washed out during heavy rain. We'd only visited twice that I could remember, once when I was little, and once for Qingming when I was 11. I didn't have any real memories of it, only fragments. A tin roof, chickens, a tree with ants crawling in lines up its trunk. It was late afternoon when we pulled into the yard. The sun had dipped behind the western ridge, casting long shadows that made the grass look blue. The house leaned slightly to one side, its roof sagging in the middle like an old spine. A single upstairs window was boarded up from the inside. The wood along the walls was dark with rain stains, and the foundation showed cracks where weeds had forced themselves through. "This is it," my father said, already unbuckling. "Home." The silence that followed wasn't joy or dread. It was the kind of silence that comes when everyone decides, together, not to complain. We got out and started unloading. The yard was soft underfoot, still wet from rain. My shoes picked up clumps of dirt with every step, and when I reached the porch with 2 boxes of canned food, I had to stomp 3 times just to loosen the mud. Mehua, my sister, dropped her bag and wandered toward the tree line. My mother called after her to stay close, and my father waved me toward the front door. The key didn't work, but the bolt gave under pressure. The smell that rolled out was stale, earthy, faintly sweet, old incense and damp wood. Inside, the house was mostly empty. A few chairs, a low table with a chipped corner. The family altar still stood in the front room, its red paper charms faded and curling at the edges. A photograph of my grandfather sat behind the incense bowl, framed in dust and crooked on its stand. We moved through the rooms in silence, checking for leaks and dead rodents. The upstairs bedroom floor creaked like it might split in half. A few old calendars hung in the hallway, stuck fast to the walls with yellowing tape. One was from 2017. The sun was almost gone when we finished hauling everything inside. I dropped my bag by the stairs, slipped off my shoes, and carried a box of bedding into what used to be my father's room. I didn't check my shoes. I didn't think about it at all. Dinner was rice, dried tofu, and greens sautéed with garlic and too much salt. My mother cooked by flashlight while my father tried to relight the pilot under the water basin. Mehua spent the meal drawing ghosts in the condensation on the window. I cleaned my bowl and went upstairs without being asked. My room faced the back slope, with a shuttered window and a bare bulb strung from the ceiling by a knotted cord. The floorboards dipped near the middle, like something heavy had once rested there for years and left an impression that never faded. I laid out a mat, blanket, and pillow, then sat down slowly and peeled off my socks. The bottoms were stiff with dried mud. I tucked them under the blanket and leaned back. Only when I was lying down did I glance across the room and see my shoes. One of them was upside down, sole up, laces curled, the toe facing toward the door. I stared at it for a moment. It wasn't strange. I remembered how I'd kicked them off, muddy, distracted, rushing to get back inside before my father could bark at me again. I probably flipped it without noticing. The other shoe was sitting upright, neatly positioned like it had landed where I meant for it to, but the left one, the one facing away, looked wrong, out of balance, slumped, like a carelessly folded hand. I told myself I'd fix it later. I was tired. I pulled the blanket tighter around my chest and closed my eyes. I didn't move again that night. I didn't dream, or if I did, nothing stayed with me. When I opened my eyes, the room was already lit with soft gray light coming through the shutters. The bulb was still on, flickering faintly, casting an uneven circle of yellow across the warped floorboards. I blinked slowly, my eyes gummy with sleep, and turned onto my side. The blanket was bunched under my arm. My mouth was dry. The house was quiet. No footsteps overhead, no shouting downstairs, no movement from Mehua's room. I sat up slowly, brushing my hand through my hair, and reached for the socks I'd stuffed under the blanket, still damp, still crumpled. I stood barefoot and stretched until my shoulders cracked. The air was cool enough to raise goosebumps across my arms. My back ached from the mat. I looked toward the shoes. The left one was still upside down. I hadn't forgotten. I remembered thinking about fixing it, planning to, but I hadn't. I'd fallen asleep staring at it and left it exactly as it was. The right one sat upright beside it, slightly farther back. Somehow their position had shifted, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but just enough that I noticed. The gap between them was wider than I remembered, not by much, inches, a finger's width. I stared at them for a while, then scratched the side of my neck and turned away. Downstairs, the stove was already burning. I heard my mother moving pans, pouring water, humming something tuneless. My father's voice grunted something about the shed. Then the back door opened and closed again. I washed my face in the cracked basin near the stairs. The water ran cold and sharp, shocking me fully awake. When I came into the kitchen, my mother handed me a bowl of congee and told me to finish before it got thin. Mehua wasn't up yet. The table was quiet. A fly buzzed lazily against the window and died trying to escape through the glass. My mother sat beside me and pulled the skin off a sweet potato with her fingers. "Did you sleep?" she asked. "Yeah, no noise?" "No." She didn't look at me, but nodded slightly. Then she reached across the table, took my left wrist gently, and wiped something from the inside with her thumb. "Dirt," she said. "You sleep like a dog." I took the bowl outside when I was done and rinsed it in the basin. The chickens were already pecking at the wet patches in the yard. The sky was low and colorless. Mist clung to the grass, and the smell of turned soil carried from the field behind the hill. I stayed out there longer than I meant to. When I finally came back inside, I went upstairs to change into dry pants. My socks were still curled under the blanket. I kicked them aside, knelt to grab a clean pair, and caught something in the edge of my vision. At first, I thought it was a water stain, something discolored on the ceiling directly above the mat. I stood slowly. The light from the bulb wobbled faintly, casting a soft yellow wash upward, and I squinted until I could make it out more clearly. It was a footprint, dark, thin, slightly smeared, upside down, pressed flat into the ceiling beam as though someone had walked across it. Not a stain, not rot. A perfect heel and 5 spread toes etched into the wood with streaks of mud. Just one. No matching print beside it. No obvious direction. just a single barefoot mark centered over where I'd slept. I tilted my head. The toes pointed toward the window. I moved closer, craning my neck, and stood on the edge of the mat until I was directly beneath it. The footprint was long, narrow, like a man's foot, but too clean. Like it hadn't come from someone walking on the floor, like it had been pressed there from above. I stayed like that for a while. Eventually, I stepped back, dressed, and went downstairs. My mother was scrubbing Mehua's shoes with a toothbrush by the basin. My father was outside hammering a hinge back into place. No one asked where I'd been. I stepped out past the garden and followed the ridge trail until it bent behind the tree line. The clouds were breaking apart in slow sheets, and patches of sunlight flickered on the wet terraces below. I could hear frogs calling somewhere deeper in the woods. The chill in the air lingered longer than it should have. When I came back, Mehua was singing to herself and drawing circles on the fogged glass of the bedroom window. I went upstairs to get my phone and paused in the doorway. The footprint was still there. I turned away and lay down on my side, facing the wall. That evening, my father made noodles. The wind pushed harder against the house, and the shutters knocked like they were testing for weak spots. My mother stuffed cloth into the cracks near the door. Mehua fell asleep with her mouth open, arms around a ratty stuffed rabbit. I sat upright for a long time, blinking slowly, watching the ceiling from the edge of the mat. I thought I heard the beam shift once, just after midnight, then nothing. No movement, no sound, just the floor beneath me cooling as the night stretched on. The next morning came colder than before. A dry chill settled in the hallway, and even with the shutters cracked, the light that crept in felt gray and washed out. I sat up slowly and rubbed my neck, the stiffness spreading all the way down my spine. I hadn't moved much in the night. When I blinked fully awake, the ceiling was the first thing I saw. The footprint hadn't faded. The mud looked the same streaks, same toes, the exact same shape, pressed just above where my pillow had been. I stared at it for a long time, breathing shallow, trying to decide if I should call someone, point it out, say something. Instead, I stood and opened the window. The cool air slipped in quickly, damp with the scent of leaves. The glass rattled slightly in its warped wooden frame, and the curtains stirred once before falling still again. My socks were still balled up on the floor. I nudged them aside with my foot and pulled on a clean pair, then reached for my jacket. There was mud along the hem, probably from the walk through the fields the day before. I looked up again. This time, there were 2 footprints. The second one was smaller, higher on the ceiling, angled differently, not quite parallel to the first, turned maybe 15 degrees, like someone had taken a step, then changed their mind. The heel was lighter, almost skipped. The toes spread wide. There was no sound, no one in the hallway. The air felt thinner. I backed up slowly and stood on the edge of the mat. My head tilted as I tried to judge how high they were, if maybe, somehow, they were my own. A prank from Mehua. Old stains I hadn't noticed the night before, but I knew what old stains looked like. These were dark, wet-looking, fresh. I looked at the soles of my feet just to be sure. Dry, clean, no mud. I left the room without changing, closing the door softly behind me. I didn't hear anyone else moving upstairs. The hallway felt hollow, like the space around me was being swallowed. Downstairs, my mother was boiling soybeans in a dented pot. The stove made a rhythmic tick-tick-tick sound with each pulse of gas. She greeted me with a quick look, but her eyes were already back on the flame. "Go check the roof tiles later," she said. "The wind's tearing one loose. I don't think I know how. You have hands, don't you?" I poured hot water into a cracked enamel cup and sat on the stool near the door. The floor under my feet was freezing. I pressed my heels to the legs of the stool to stay off it. A while later, Mehua stumbled in, half asleep, dragging her blanket across the floor. She dropped it by the stove and crouched next to the pot, her head against her knees. "Mom," she said, "I heard walking last night." My mother didn't look up. On the roof, Mehua added. It was wind. It had steps. Roofs don't walk, Mehua. The girl blinked slowly, her fingers tracing circles on the side of the pot. I saw footprints on the tiles, she said, from the window, probably from your father when he fixed the antenna. Mehua didn't argue, but she didn't look convinced either. My father came in from the shed a few minutes later, stomping mud off his boots. He asked for salt. My mother handed him the shaker without speaking. I carried my cup out into the yard and leaned against the tree beside the old stone path. It was quieter than usual. No cicadas, no chickens, just the wind combing through the tall grass and the wet thud of something shifting in the woods behind the fence. The sky was still a pale, overcast white. The sun was somewhere behind it, diffused and distant. I sipped slowly, letting the cup warm my fingers. After lunch, I told my mother I was going to sweep the second floor. She nodded like she hadn't heard. I went up with the dustpan, an old rag, and no plan. The first print was where I'd left it. The second hadn't changed either. But now there was a third, farther along the beam. It was fainter. The edge of the toes was blurred like the weight had shifted mid-step. It pointed slightly away from the others. I stepped back, trying to follow a line. The distance between them wasn't quite even. The spacing was wrong. Too far apart for a slow walk, too close for a run. No symmetry, no pattern, just steps. I circled the room twice with the rag in my hand, never touching the ceiling. The air smelled the same. Dust, paper, damp wood. I pushed the mat aside and dragged the stool underneath the central beam. I stood up carefully and raised my hand until my fingertips nearly brushed the wood. The closest print was maybe 20 centimeters out of reach. No ladder in the house would get high enough. No one had touched the ceiling in years, maybe ever. I stepped down slowly and set the stool back in the corner. In the hallway, I checked the ceiling outside my door. Nothing, just cobwebs and a nail where a picture used to hang. But in Mehua's room, another footprint. This one was nearly at the center of her ceiling, above the small table where she kept her pens and plastic jewelry box. It was a left foot, same size as the others. Bare, muddy, pressed firm into the wood. She wasn't in the room, so I backed out and shut the door quietly behind me. When I came back down, she was sitting cross-legged on the back porch, humming something off-key and feeding rice grains to an ant trail. My father was arguing with someone over the phone in the other room. My mother had gone back to scrubbing bowls. I spent the rest of the day pretending to read. I kept thinking about the distance between the prints, about the size of them, the direction. None of it made sense. They didn't follow the shape of the room. They didn't lead anywhere. They just existed, like something had entered the house already knowing where to step. After dinner, I walked the perimeter of the house alone. The yard was soft and sticky in places, and I nearly lost my sandal in a patch of thick clay near the broken fence. The moon wasn't out, but the sky had cleared enough to make out the silhouette of the trees on the hillside. I heard the buzz of a mosquito but didn't feel it land. The grass near the base of the back wall had been pressed down, not trampled, not flattened, just laid gently at an angle, like something had passed through once and never came back. I looked up at the roof. The edge of the second-floor eaves curved downward slightly, and beneath them, in the narrow space between two warped boards, I saw a line of dark streaks. Not like rust, not like water damage, more like smears. I turned and went back inside. That night, I didn't brush my teeth. I didn't wash my face. I sat on the mat with the blanket folded in my lap and stared up at the ceiling. I didn't bother counting them anymore. They weren't in order. Not all of them were clear. Some were drying, cracking slightly at the edges. Some were recent, sharp, still dark with whatever had made them. I lay back slowly, eyes still open. The boards above me creaked once, then nothing. I woke sometime before dawn to the sound of a slow step directly above me. I didn't move. I kept my breathing shallow, my body still, my eyes open just enough to see the ceiling lit by the weak orange glow of the bulb. The step came again. A light shift of weight. No boards creaked this time. The movement was smooth, silent, the kind of thing you feel through your bones more than your ears. Then another. Each footfall landed with too much care, like whoever was up there didn't want to be heard, only felt. The direction was wrong. The steps didn't come from the hallway or the stairs. They began above me and moved toward the far wall, pausing once halfway across the room. Then they reversed. Same path, same weight, same speed. No scraping, no dragging, just the soft, invisible thud of bare feet pressing into wood. Eventually they stopped, and I kept still long after the silence returned. When the sun finally pushed a faint gray through the window, I sat up and looked at the ceiling. There were more prints. I counted 6 without standing, some older, some newer. The mud had dried on one, split open around the arch, but the one near the corner of the room looked wet, still shiny in places. They were spreading now, not forming a trail, just appearing. One had a visible smear, as if the foot had slid an inch before pushing off again. I didn't go downstairs right away. I waited until the light came in strong enough that the shadows under the beam disappeared, then got dressed and left the room without brushing my hair. My father was sharpening a blade in the backyard. I could hear the scrape of metal from the kitchen window. My mother was boiling soybeans again, steam rising from the pot in long ribbons. "Someone needs to clean the windows today," she said without looking at me. "You can't see anything out of them. I'll do it. No streaks. Use vinegar." Maywa was sitting on the front steps, barefoot, dangling her toes into the wet dirt. I nudged her with my knee as I passed, and she stuck her tongue out at me. By mid-morning I had the cloth and bucket out and was scrubbing the outer glass of the upstairs windows. The shutters stuck when I tried to open them. One hinge was swollen and made a crunching sound when it bent. From this angle I could see the roof, not all of it, just the slope above the porch. The tiles were uneven, some chipped, a few missing. There was debris between the ridges, twigs, leaves, dirt. But what caught my eye wasn't the debris. There were marks in the dust, too narrow for animal tracks, too long. They came in from the upper ridge, landed on a loose tile near the middle, then stopped, like someone had stepped down, then disappeared. I leaned farther out, trying to follow the line, but the view cut off past the corner gutter. I had to plant my elbow against the windowsill just to keep from falling forward. Inside the glass I caught my own reflection for a second. Hollow-eyed, pale, blurred with grime, and then the wind shifted and pulled the curtain across it. I closed the window and went back inside. That night I stayed awake with the light off. The house groaned with the usual pressure of cooling wood. The night insects buzzed somewhere out in the fields. A tree branch tapped against the roof tiles, but softer than before. The first step came at 2:11 a.m. I checked the clock on my phone. The second step followed 4 seconds later, then another. They circled the perimeter of the room, tracing the edge of the ceiling where the beams joined the wall. No rush, no hesitation. I didn't blink. I didn't breathe too deeply. I just lay still and listened. The steps paused above the far corner, the one where the stool sat. The next step landed directly over me. The plank creaked. A quiet, heavy exhale followed. Not for me. The weight stayed there, not shifting, not pacing, just hovering above my chest as if waiting for something. I felt my own pulse start to race. A numb throb spread across my back where it pressed against the mat. I fought the urge to turn my head. The weight receded after a minute. Not fast, not startled. It just resumed its path like it had been interrupted, like I hadn't met whatever condition it had been waiting for. At dawn, I sat up and stared at the ceiling. The print over my chest was darker than the rest. Deep, the mud had oozed slightly at the edges like it had been freshly pressed into the board. I didn't eat breakfast. My mother didn't ask. My father spent the morning shouting at the generator, and when it sputtered out a second time, he told Mehoa to bring him a wrench. She gave him a wooden spoon instead and laughed when he threw it at the ground. I wandered out to the storage room beside the barn. It was mostly empty, just rusted tools, broken furniture, and an old basin full of nails. The far wall had a ladder nailed to it, the kind that used to reach the upper grain loft. I climbed it slowly, my hand brushing aside cobwebs. The top half of the loft was missing its floorboards. You could see straight down to the packed dirt below. But the rafters had prints on them. 1, 2, 3, maybe more. All upside down, pressed into the underside of the slats like someone had been crawling along them. Not from above, not through the open air, beneath the beams, like a fly clinging to the ceiling. I stepped back without meaning to and bumped my shoulder against the frame. A faint cloud of dust drifted from the board above me. Something inside the wall creaked, very slowly. I backed down the ladder without turning around, hand over hand, careful not to look up again. By the time I returned to the house, the sun was almost gone. The upstairs smelled stale again. The air had thickened somehow, even with the windows cracked. A faint trace of something, like mildew, clung to the corners, sharp at the back of my throat. That night, I left the bulb on again. At exactly 2:11 a.m., I heard the first step. It was already over me. Not approaching, not circling, just there, over my chest as if it had always been. I kept my eyes on the ceiling. I could see the faint outline of the darker beam crossing above me, the uneven grain of the wood catching what little light bled in from the hallway. My breathing felt tight and shallow, like there wasn't quite enough space inside my ribs. The floor didn't creak. There was no shift of weight, but I could feel it. I don't know how else to explain it. There was nothing to see, nothing to hear, but the space above me had changed. The air pressed downward, not heavy exactly, but present. Like when you know someone's standing behind you even before they speak. Then it moved. The motion wasn't fast. One step, then another. Barefoot, soft but exact. It crossed the room without brushing against the light fixture or the edges of the walls. There was no brushing of fabric, no displaced dust. It passed silently through the ceiling like a spider navigating the underside of glass. I held my breath. When it reached the far corner, by the window, it stopped again. I counted the seconds. At 10 it shifted. Its path continued and I recognized the direction. Toward the hallway. My heart started to pound. The steps grew lighter as they moved away from me, out through the ceiling. The sounds were harder to track now, muffled by the thickness of the beam and the insulation above. But I could still trace it. It stopped again just past my doorway. Maewa's room was next. I sat up as quietly as I could. The blanket pulled across my legs with a soft rasp, and I froze until I was sure nothing had changed. Then I got up and crossed the room, bare feet silent on the mat. I pressed my hand against the door frame, then eased the door open just enough to slip into the hallway. Everything looked normal. The floorboards shone faintly in the light coming from the bathroom window at the far end of the hall. The wood was pale in places where the finish had worn down. My father's room was closed. Maewa's door was open a few inches. I walked slowly, my toes curled with each step, trying to soften the creaks. I reached her door and peered inside. She was asleep on her side, one arm draped over a stuffed rabbit, the blanket twisted around her legs. The moonlight filtered through the slats of the shutters and cast narrow bands of shadow across her face. I looked at the ceiling. There were 2 footprints, both above her bed, parallel, as if something had stood there quietly, watching her. I stared for a long time. I thought about waking her, about calling my mother, about saying something out loud just to hear a voice. But I didn't. I backed out of the doorway and returned to my room. The ceiling was quiet again. The air had shifted back, less taut, less electric. Still, I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I didn't check the ceiling until after breakfast. My mother made congee again, and my father asked if I had seen the shed door swing open in the night. I shook my head. Mehua sat across from me, chewing slowly, the sleeves of her shirt too long and nearly dipping into the bowl. She said nothing, just hummed the same off-key melody from the day before. When I went back upstairs, the prints were still there, not just the ones from last night. More. 3 new ones in the hallway, one on the ceiling above the stairwell, a faint smear at the edge of the bathroom door frame, like a foot had slipped mid-step. They weren't just in my room anymore, they were spreading. I returned to my room, shut the door quietly, and sat on the mat with my knees pulled up against my chest. I tried to imagine a way this could be explained. Mold, some kind of animal, a trick of condensation. Maybe I was walking in my sleep, maybe I'd done it myself. But I'd seen the angles, the spacing, they weren't mine, and I hadn't walked on the ceiling. That night, I left the light on again. I lay still from the moment I got under the blanket. I didn't bring my phone with me. I didn't check the time. I just stared at the ceiling until my eyes burned. The house settled once around midnight. The second floor groaned a little in the wind. And then, footsteps. They didn't start in my room this time. They began somewhere else. A heavier step, not quite as soft. Maybe the hallway, maybe the kitchen roof. But they approached, soft, deliberate, careful. The same pace as before. I turned my head slowly and looked toward the door. The ceiling above it creaked just once, and then the steps passed into the space over me again. There was no pause this time. It moved straight across the room, pacing the same trail it had the night before. I watched the ceiling. I didn't blink. The shape of one of the dried footprints had flaked slightly at the edge. The mud had started to peel. One wet footprint passed over it, nearly aligning, but not quite. The spacing was always slightly off. The thing didn't retrace its own steps. It made new ones. Each night the pattern shifted. That was the part that began to bother me the most. It wasn't random. It was purposeful. The road changed. The pauses were different. Sometimes it stood in one corner for several minutes. Sometimes it circled the light. Once it pressed against the ceiling beam directly over my chest and stayed there until I could feel the sweat soaking through my shirt. When it finally left, it never made a sound at the stairs, no thump, no decline in elevation. It simply faded away, gone between one footstep and the next. After 3 nights of this, I began to notice something else. The smell. It was faint at first. Damp earth, the sharp tang of wet leaves. But as the prints accumulated, the scent thickened. By the end of the week, it clung to the ceiling, and it followed the prints from room to room. I caught it once in the morning when my mother opened the hallway window to shake out a rug. The air that rushed in pushed the smell down with it. Mildew, rot, and the faintest trace of something sweet, like old rice wine gone sour. Mehua wrinkled her nose and asked if something died in the walls. My mother told her to stop talking nonsense. I didn't speak. That night I waited for it again, and it came right on time. That night I waited for it again. I didn't lie down. I sat on the mat with my back against the wall, and my legs crossed under the blanket, eyes fixed on the ceiling. The light bulb was still on, though it had begun to dim over the past few days. Sometimes it buzzed faintly, like it was straining to hold itself together. I didn't check the time. I didn't need to. The weight returned like it always did. Not sudden, not loud, just presence. That pressure that slides down your spine when a room becomes too still. Then the first step, soft, bare, careful. It pressed down through the beam above my head, and for the first time, I didn't feel afraid, not in the usual way. It wasn't that I felt brave either. I just didn't have anything left to burn off. My fear had nowhere else to go. It moved across the ceiling, slowly. Its pacing had grown more deliberate, less like walking and more like searching. I stayed still, my eyes wide, adjusting slowly to the thin yellow light that filled the room. When it stopped over the window, the air shifted again. I could hear it breathe, a faint whistle, not sharp enough to be human, not wet like an animal's breath either, just Thin, controlled. It hung there for maybe 2 full minutes. The sound stopped, then it moved again. I didn't follow it with my eyes. I just watched the center of the room. It passed near the bulb, and for the briefest second, I saw a shadow move across the light, like something solid had interrupted the space between the fixture and the ceiling, but upside down. Then it dropped out of view again. I blinked hard, and my heart started hammering in my chest, but I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I just waited. When the next step landed above my knees, I looked up fully, and I saw it. The thing clinging to the ceiling didn't speak. It didn't blink. It didn't react. It just crawled, arms and legs stretched across the planks with the wrong kind of posture, like it had been walking upside down its entire life. Not scuttling, not jerking, smooth, controlled, balanced. Its skin was the color of wet clay, stretched thin over long joints that protruded in places that didn't make sense. Elbows that curved too far backward, knees that bent like wire twisted too many times. Its ribs shifted visibly with each breath, and the soles of its feet were black with mud. Its head was tilted back slightly, chin raised, the underside of its jaw pressed flat against the wood. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could see the shape of its skull, narrow and elongated, jaw slack and hollow, like it hadn't used its mouth in years. It passed directly over me. There was no weight, no push on my chest, but I felt it, like a thread being pulled through a needle, like gravity itself had turned away from me to welcome something else. It didn't pause. It didn't turn. It kept crawling, arms extending, shoulders dipping slightly as each palm connected with the ceiling and pulled. It passed the light again, and its outline smeared across the ceiling like a shadow folded inward. Then it was gone, beyond the edge of the beam, into the hallway. I stayed seated for a long time. I couldn't tell if I had breathed at all while it was there. My lips felt dry. My chest ached. The air had shifted again, still cold but heavier, like the smell of rain before it hits the earth. Except this wasn't rain. It was dirt, wet, fermented earth, the kind you dig through in places that haven't seen sunlight in decades. My ears were ringing. Eventually, I stood and walked to the door. I didn't open it. I just pressed my ear to the wood and listened. Nothing. No footsteps. No scuttling. Just the low hum of the night outside. I looked up at the ceiling near the top of the doorframe. Another print. Smudged. Smeared slightly at the toes. I stepped back, shut the door softly, and returned to the mat. I didn't sleep. I sat against the wall again until morning came. The next day, Meiwa told me she saw something in her room. She said it without looking up from her drawing, just a quiet sentence, almost casual. Something was walking on the ceiling, she said. Last night, I stared at her for a second. What did it look like? I asked. She shrugged. I only saw the shadow. My mother didn't react. She was stirring something in a bowl. My father was outside again, fixing the same pipe for the 3rd time that week. I thought it might be a person, Meiwa said, but its legs were bent weird. Did it say anything? She shook her head. Did it stop? No, just kept going. It didn't look at me. Were you scared? A little, she said. Then she wiped her finger across the table, clearing a patch of dust, and started drawing a spiral in the empty space. My mother told her to stop smudging the surface, but her voice sounded dull. After breakfast, I checked her ceiling. The footprints were there, 2 of them. One over the window, one directly above her headboard. Neither were sharp, just vague mud stains now, drying at the edges, flaking into fine powder along the cracks in the boards. I went back to my room and found a new one just inside the closet door, partially vertical, as if it had begun descending down the wall but changed its mind. That night, I sat with the light off. The darkness came slower than I expected. My eyes adjusted quickly. The moonlight through the shutters made pale stripes across the mat. I waited. 2:11. The ceiling looked the same as it always did. Uneven planks, swollen seams, blackened nail heads. A thin crack ran along the central beam, where one side of the board had warped from moisture. In the dim light, it looked almost like a vein, faint, pulsing, breathing. I waited. The room was cold again, not a weather cold, not the kind you feel in your hands and shake off. This came from the ceiling, from the beams, from something that seeped downward in a slow, silent draft that didn't stir the curtains or the air. The bulb overhead buzzed once, dimmed, then flared briefly brighter before fading back to its tired yellow. That was when I felt it return. No sound, no breeze, just presence. The skin on my arms prickled, my chest grew tight. Every part of me knew something was here, even before I looked up. I didn't raise my head, not yet. I stared straight ahead, waiting for the quiet to shift, for the ceiling to acknowledge me. Then came the first sound, a joint bending, not a footstep, not a creak, just the faint crack of cartilage, like knuckles turning. And then another, this time above the door. I turned my eyes slowly upward. At first I didn't see it, just the usual, planks, nails, stains. Then the shadows between two beams stretched wrong, elongated, drooped. I blinked once. The shape was there. A man, naked, pressed flat against the ceiling, arms extended, knees bent like a spider caught mid-crawl. His body didn't move with breath. It only adjusted slightly, hips angling, elbows tightening, toes curling around the edge of the wood. His skin was gray, not smooth but rippled like it had been soaked too long in water. The folds around his shoulders and ribs shimmered faintly with something wet. The soles of his feet were black. Mud coated the undersides in thick patches that cracked when he shifted slightly. He was clinging to the ceiling like it was the ground. The longer I looked, the more wrong he became. His arms were too long. His knees stuck too far out to the side. His back arched high in the center like his spine had an extra curve built into it. But nothing about him felt broken. He was designed this way, built to move where no one should. His head was angled down, facing the floor, the top of his skull aimed at me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My vision trembled at the edges, my heart beat loud in my ears. His neck turned, no jerk, no twitch, just a slow, deliberate rotation as his chin dipped and his face began to tilt in my direction, still upside down, still clinging to the ceiling. The light bulb caught the sheen on his jaw, then slid over the ridges of his cheekbones and down the hollow of his eye sockets. His eyes were open, too wide, no whites, just a gloss of black across both orbits, as if the sockets had been filled with tar. His mouth hung partially open, jaw slack, lips pale and cracked. He didn't blink. He just looked down at me. The ceiling didn't groan. His weight didn't disturb the beams. There was no noise, no breath, no sound at all except the blood rushing in my ears. He didn't reach for me, didn't crawl. He just hung there, perfectly balanced, staring. And I stared back. Time folded in on itself. I don't know how long we stayed like that, him above, me below, neither moving. I couldn't scream. I couldn't flinch. The terror didn't peak or crash. It just stretched thin and endless. His shoulders shifted once, like a cat stretching. Then he pressed his chin slightly lower. I thought for one terrifying second that he might drop, that he might let go and fall on me, all knees and elbows and wet skin and open eyes. But he didn't. He crawled away, slowly, back into the dark, back across the ceiling, his limbs pulling in strange arcs, his head swiveling last, until it vanished past the edge of the beam. Gone. I didn't sleep. I didn't move from that spot until morning. I sat on the mat, knees to my chest, the blanket hanging limp at my side. My mouth was dry. My legs trembled with pins and needles. When the sun rose, the room filled with dusty gold light. It pushed the shadows back across the ceiling, but the footprints remained, more than ever, dozens of them, trailing in every direction, pressed hard into the beams. I stood slowly and opened the door. In the hallway, more, leading to the stairs. Outside Mehua's room, a single print, right above the doorframe, angled downward. I didn't speak during breakfast. I didn't answer when my mother asked what was wrong. But I looked at her hands. She was burning incense, carefully, the first time since we moved in. Later that afternoon, I saw her preparing something by the altar, carefully, deliberately, not rushed. Red cloth, 2 bowls of rice, 3 sticks of incense laid beside a jar of sweet wine, and a pair of shoes, brand new, small, upright, soles aligned, toes pointed toward the window. I didn't ask. I just stood at the edge of the room and watched her arrange everything with quiet, practiced hands. She didn't look at me when she spoke. "Tonight," she said, "you'll take it to the barn." She didn't explain. She didn't tell me what it was for. She didn't say anything about what I might see. Or not see. She just finished laying out the items in silence, then folded the red cloth over the bowls so the rice wouldn't cool too quickly. The shoes were small, maybe child size, new but not bright. The soles were clean, the fabric uncreased. They looked like they'd never been worn, not even tried on. But they weren't pristine. The canvas was off-white, just a little yellowed, the color of something that had waited. When I glanced back up at her face, she was already gone. The air in the house felt heavier than it had during the day. Not hotter, heavier, thick with burnt incense and the faint trace of something damp, like mildew hiding behind the walls. I could smell the wine even through the cloth. Sweet, sharp, fermented. The sky outside had gone full blue-gray, not yet night, but dim enough that I had to squint to see the edge of the tree line. The barn was about 30 meters from the back of the house, across a stretch of matted grass and uneven earth. I'd only been in there twice, once to look for a shovel, once to find the wheelbarrow. The crawl space beneath it was an afterthought, just a low gap between the slanted floor and the stone slab it rested on, half covered by fallen boards. It hadn't been used for anything in years. Even the chickens avoided it. I picked up the red cloth carefully and folded it in on itself, holding everything bundled like a gift I didn't want to carry. No one stopped me as I walked through the kitchen. No one said a word. The wind was still. No crickets, no frogs. Just the soft, steady sound of my own shoes on dirt. The barn looked darker than it should have. The door was half open, tilted on its hinges, one side hanging slightly lower than the other. I didn't touch it. I just slipped through the gap and stood still for a moment, letting my eyes adjust. The inside smelled like rotted hay and rust. The far wall leaned away from the beams like the entire structure had exhaled and decided not to straighten again. Something scratched faintly in the rafters, probably a rat. I crouched low and moved toward the back corner. The crawl space opening was exactly where I remembered it, between 2 slanted floorboards that dipped beneath the rest of the barn. The gap was just tall enough to crawl through, but narrow. You had to lie almost flat to fit. A broken piece of gutter pipe leaned nearby, covered in spider webs. One of the boards over the gap had fallen inward. The others looked ready to collapse. I knelt beside the hole and unfolded the cloth slowly. The bowls went first, one on each side, then the wine, then the incense, which I lit using a match from the bundle tucked under the wrap. It hissed slightly when it caught, the smoke curling into the crawl space and disappearing into the dark. Last, I placed the shoes. I set them side by side, upright, heels touching, facing the void. They didn't make a sound when I let go. I stared into the opening for a while. It was darker than it should have been, deeper. The crawl space didn't go more than 6 feet, but the shadows stretched past that, pooling under the barn like water backing up behind a blocked drain. The incense crackled faintly, one stick bending in the heat. I leaned closer. I didn't see anything, but I smelled it. The same smell that had been clinging to the ceiling for days now. Earthy, sour, like something wet that had dried too quickly and then been forgotten. It rose from the opening in steady waves, wrapping around my ankles and throat like fog. I stayed crouched for a full minute longer. Nothing came out, nothing moved. Then I stood and backed away, one step at a time, never turning. The barn didn't creak, the floor didn't shift, the wind didn't rise, but the smell followed me back to the house. When I closed the kitchen door behind me, the incense smell from inside seemed sharper than before, as if it had noticed me again. The photograph on the altar looked slightly crooked, or maybe the frame had warped. No one asked me if I had done it. They just cleared a space on the table for me and placed a bowl of noodles in front of the empty chair. I didn't speak. I didn't eat. Mehua rested her head on her arms, eyes open, breathing shallowly. That night, I returned to my room and didn't turn the light on. I lay on my side, blanket pulled to my chin, facing the window. The shutters creaked occasionally, even though the wind outside had died. Somewhere beneath the floorboards, the house settled like an old man easing into a chair. The ceiling behind me remained silent. No footsteps, no pacing. I waited until my legs started to ache, then turned slowly and looked up. There were no new footprints. The beams looked the same. The air had changed again though, not warm or cold, just thinner, like something had been exhaled, like a weight had been shifted from one place to another. I sat up and pressed my hand to the mat. It felt the same. My chest still felt tight, but the pressure above had faded. I got up and walked into the hallway. Mehua's door was open. Her ceiling was clear. The hallway, clean. The bathroom, nothing. I checked every room, even the ceiling above the altar. No prints, no residue, no smell. When I opened the door to my room again, it hit me more fully. Absence. The thing was gone. But I didn't relax. I lay back down and waited for the ceiling to creak, for the pressure to return, for the black feet to press into the wood again. They didn't. Not that night. I didn't sleep the next night either. Not because I was scared. I was. But that wasn't it. It was because I didn't trust that it was over. The prince had vanished after the offering, yes. The ceiling felt empty, the air lighter. The tension in my chest had gone slack, like an arm being let down from a long-held position. But not enough time had passed. Not enough silence, not enough certainty. So I stayed up again, staring at the wooden beams above me, counting them in the dark. 1, 2, 3, 4 above the foot of the bed. 5, 6 near the edge. 7 that led to the door. 8 that disappeared into shadow near the dresser. I watched them for hours, watched the knots in the wood, the way the faint moonlight slipped between the seams, the gentle wobble of my ceiling fan blades that didn't turn. At some point, I heard Mother cough once down the hall. Mehua stirred and turned in her sleep, a creak near the bathroom, a drip from the kitchen faucet, and nothing more. I fell asleep just after 5, only for an hour. I kept my shoes beside the door, upright side by side, perfectly aligned, and checked them again first thing in the morning. Still upright. I didn't say anything to Mother. She didn't say anything to me, but she lit another stick of incense and placed it beside the burnt remnants of the offering plate, as if keeping the memory of it alive a little longer. That day passed quietly, too quietly. There was a kind of stillness I hadn't noticed before that had nothing to do with sound. It was the stillness of knowing something was watching, but not now. Just soon. When night came again, I sat on my bed and didn't even try to pretend I would sleep. This time I didn't wait under the blankets. I sat in the center of my bed, legs crossed, flashlight gripped in one hand and a fresh pair of shoes in the other, just in case. I kept the flashlight off to preserve my eyes. I didn't want to be blinded if I had to switch it on. At exactly 1:12 a.m. I heard the sound, a single creak, barely audible. Not wood shifting, not something settling. Wait, it had returned. I turned my head slowly toward the door and listened. Another creak, faint, controlled, the sound of something moving across the ceiling without touching the floor. I stood, moved quietly to the door, pressed my ear to it. Nothing. But when I opened the door a sliver and peeked through the hallway, my breath caught. The prints were back, starting in the hallway. Blackened, wet-looking prints, spaced out in eerie rhythm, silent, oily, leading from the end of the corridor where Mehua's door was shut tight, toward mine. I turned the flashlight on and shined it up. There they were, above me, overlapping slightly now, as if something had crawled across the ceiling once, and then crawled back again. I didn't open the door farther. I didn't call for Mother. I didn't dare. I closed the door gently, slid the lock, stepped backward until I felt the edge of my bed behind my knees. Then I sat and waited. The house was silent, but my ceiling creaked. Once, twice, then nothing. My light was still on. I angled it toward the ceiling. There were no prints in my room yet. I stared at the beams, the same 8 beams I had counted before. This time it didn't start with a print. It started with a shadow that shouldn't have been there. Near the wall, halfway up the slope of the ceiling, there was a discoloration, almost imperceptible, like someone had smudged the wood. Like a spot of moisture was darkening the surface. Then it deepened, stretched, the shape of a palm, then another. A bare, wet footprint pressed into the beam above the dresser, toes downward, heel against the slope. Then another. Closer. The prints were coming from above the crawl space, from the corner where I'd placed the offering 2 nights ago. It was coming back down. I froze. The beam creaked. Then I saw it. First the hand, pale and misshapen, fingertips too long, skin textured like soft clay that hadn't dried all the way. Then the arm, a shoulder, an elbow bent the wrong direction as it maneuvered across the ceiling, crawling. Then came the leg, the foot, then the torso. It was naked, slick, skin glistening like it was still being molded, like it hadn't set, its head tilted, not in curiosity but in failure, as if the muscles didn't understand the correct tension to hold itself upright, and it was upside down. It clung to the beams with its bare hands and feet, not like a monkey, not like an acrobat, more like a puppet strung on wires that moved without coordination. Its pelvis dragged across the wood, its ribs flexed unnaturally. It reached the center of my room, directly above me. I had not moved. The flashlight was off. I don't remember turning it off, but my thumb was locked in place, as if I'd clicked it on instinct. The thing above me did not speak. It did not twitch. It hung there, upside down, inches above my head, just swaying slightly from its unnatural tension, as if the weight of its limbs couldn't decide whether to fall or float. Its eyes were closed, but then it inhaled. No sound, just a visible expansion of its sides like a frog inflating, and then its eyes opened. Not wide, just barely. Enough. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. The figure's fingers began flexing, tapping once, twice on the wooden beam. The foot twitched, the head tilted farther, neck coiling like it was adjusting its perspective, studying me from the wrong angle. Then it stopped. Everything stopped. It waited. And I lay there perfectly still. Its skin looked wetter the longer I stared, like the moisture was collecting, like it would start dripping. The ceiling fan creaked slightly as it shifted under the weight of the thing. I didn't blink, I didn't move, I didn't reach for my flashlight again. I stared, and it waited. The breath never left my chest. I didn't remember the moment it crawled back. I only remember waking up to a dry beam, a clean ceiling, no prints, but the flashlight had rolled to the floor, and the edge of my mattress still felt warm where I had clenched my fists into it all night. The thing didn't touch me. It didn't speak. It just waited. Then it left. I woke to silence. Gray morning light seeped through the thin curtains, not bright enough to be morning, not dark enough to still be night. The bulb overhead was off, but I could make out the shapes of the furniture, the shelf near the window, the red lacquered chair with its cushion half collapsed, the suitcase I never fully unpacked. My blanket had slipped to the floor. I reached down slowly to grab it, afraid I'd see dark feet above me, but there was nothing. The ceiling, as far as I could tell, was clean. No streaks, no smears, just bare wood and exposed beams stretching overhead like bones under skin. I sat up and scanned every inch of the planks. Nothing. I rose and crept to the door, half expecting to find fresh footprints leading away, but the hallway was untouched. The lights were off. The shadows didn't twitch or lean, and the air no longer felt like it was holding its breath. The weight had lifted. I turned into the kitchen. Mother was already up, kneeling on a red mat near the altar. Her hair was bound tight with a white ribbon, and a single stick of incense smoked between her fingers. She didn't look at me. The room smelled of ginger and burnt paper. On the stove, a pot of congee bubbled gently. 3 bowls sat ready on the table, but she made no move to serve them. Instead, she stayed where she was, facing the altar, whispering something too soft to hear. At her side, the red cloth from the night before had been folded neatly. The offering shoes were gone. I opened my mouth to ask, what happened? Did it work? Was it gone? But something about her posture stopped me. Her back was stiff. Her eyes didn't flick. Instead, she reached to the incense burner and slowly, silently, pinched out the last curl of smoke. She rose without speaking and took the red cloth to the back door. Outside, the sun was just rising. I followed her only far enough to see where she knelt in the yard again. A small metal tin sat on the packed dirt in front of her. In it, the pair of old white shoes she used to wear inside the house, flattened at the soles, canvas frayed at the edges. She poured clear alcohol over them. Then she lit a match and dropped it in. The flame caught instantly, licking the shoes like they were paper. The smoke was thick and sour, the kind that clings to your clothes. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She waited until the shoes were blackened husks before she poured water over the tin and went back inside. When she passed me, she didn't say anything. She just brushed past, her face unreadable. I sat on the edge of the porch and stared at the steaming metal bowl until the last of the smoke disappeared. I kept expecting something else to happen. Prints on the barn ceiling, a creak above the hallway, a whisper from the crawl space. But it was just morning, and it stayed morning. For the rest of that week, nothing changed. The ceilings stayed clean. No more noises, no more shadows, no more weight in the air. I helped Mother scrub the floorboards with vinegar and hot water. I burned another stick of incense every evening before dinner. I even helped hang red paper charms over the crawlspace hatch in the barn. No new prints appeared. Mehua was herself again, laughing too loud, stomping around the house in her pink house slippers, throwing bean sprouts at me when I teased her about the neighbor boy. By the time school started again, it was as if the summer had never happened. But I knew better, and Mother did too. She never said a word about the prints or the ceiling, or the way her face looked the night she asked me to carry the offering to the barn. But I noticed things. She started keeping a tray of shoes by every door, 2 pairs placed upright on red cloth, toes pointed inward, always perfectly aligned. She began muttering old phrases under her breath while sweeping the floors, not prayers exactly, but protective phrases from her childhood. She even rearranged the furniture in the guest room so the bed was no longer directly beneath the ceiling beams. She told me it was for better airflow. I didn't argue. I started checking my shoes every morning, twice, sometimes 3 times to make sure none of them were left upside down. Eventually, I stopped thinking about it every day. Eventually, the memory dulled, like a dream that feels vivid until you try to explain it. Eventually, we moved. It was nearly a year later, after Father finally got the transfer he wanted. We packed everything into 2 vans, wrapped dishes in old newspapers, folded up the red cloths, and tucked them in Mother's cedar box. Mehua was excited, bouncing up and down in the front seat like a squirrel on caffeine. The new place was smaller, no barn, no crawl space, but clean. Mother still kept the shoes on red cloths, even in the new house, and I still checked mine. One afternoon, I came back to the old house to help gather the last few things. Some quilts we left hanging in the storage room, a box of winter coats, my old electric fan. I had almost everything packed up and ready by dusk. The house was empty, stripped of its sounds and smells, but I still walked through slowly, flicking on each light, scanning every corner. Nothing moved. The ceilings were still clean. No streaks, no prints, no pressure in the air. Just old wood, dry paint, and faint dust in the corners. But when I got to my old room, I paused. I hadn't been back inside since we first packed it up. Everything was gone. Desk, mattress, shelves. Only the overhead light fixture remained, a frosted glass dome bolted to a central beam, with a short pull chain hanging beneath. I stepped beneath it. Something caught the light, just a faint smudge on the underside of the glass. I squinted and reached up. It was small, a perfect oval, 5 tiny toes, a single barefoot print, pressed to the glass like something had hung there, suspended, inches above me while I slept. I didn't touch it. I didn't clean it. I didn't breathe. I stepped back and left the room, and never came back.